Everybody, welcome back to Meta Perspective, where we go meta on subjects like insight, awakening, and reality. And today we have a special little panel talk. We have Vince Horn and Daniel Ingram. Welcome, guys.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, and everybody's going to be basically familiar with you guys, pretty much. But just for people listening and watching, can you guys both give a short intro of yourself, starting with Vince?
Yeah, sure. So the main thing that I'm known for, I guess, on the interwebs is running and starting a project called Buddhist Geeks. And one of our first guests on that show on the podcast was actually Daniel. So Daniel was sort of an unofficial. I consider him an unofficial founder of the company as well. Thank you for being willing to be on a podcast that no one had heard of in 2006. Yeah, and since that time, I guess Buddhist Geeks has become sort of one of the many podcasts exploring this sort of intersection of modernity and contemplative practice, and how are we continuing to relate to these Buddhist wisdom traditions, all the texts and the traditions that have been handed down. While we're also on the internet and living really complex lives and dealing with things like the ecological crisis. So that's kind of, I guess, my day job, just trying to teach meditation and also, grapple with what the hell this even is that I'm doing and teaching.
Yeah.
So good to be here.
Great.
And what about? Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah. So I'm Daniel Ingram. I'm a retired emergency medicine physician, also with training in epidemiology and some other things. And actually, Vince and I co-founded, it was really his suggestion, the Dharma Overground, which is, one of the forums where people talk about deep dive practice. So thank you to Vince for that inspiration, helping to get that up and running initially. Very important. And so I also am an author of the book Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, and I teach some meditation stuff, and the acting CEO and board chair of Emergence Benefactors, which is the charity to support the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, which I also helped start with a whole lot of other people. And that's dedicated to bringing very ontologically neutral and methods of science and research to the question of how to upgrade the mainstream public's and clinical world's understandings of what we're calling emergent phenomena, which is basically the highs, lows, and weirds of the meditative path that often get ignored or pathologized or made taboo, etc. And so our goal is to help upgrade the clinical understanding and public awareness of these things such that they can be just discussed like anything else rather than a strange taboo topic, which they currently often are in a lot of circles.
Oh, thank you for that, Daniel. And, thank you so much, Vince and Daniel, for being here. I greatly appreciate it. And, there are a few things I know we want to discuss today. One thing was kind of like lineages. So I guess you can say Dharma lineages. And also, I kind of wanted to branch off into a 21st century Dharma thing, which actually sounds a lot like what Vince is doing. So as far as lineages, I guess I'm an outsider on that in the Dharma world so much. So I guess you, Vince, and Daniel are actually associated with a similar lineage. Is that correct?
This is really complicated. So
there we go.
The use of the term lineage it's going to require a bit of unpacking here. Vince, you want to go ahead?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'll be able to unpack it all, but I will say, I do in some general way do consider myself connected to Daniel in a kind of familial way in the Dharma world, because you were my first real teacher, Daniel. Your book was a huge impetus for me getting serious about meditation, and having conversations with you back then was really helpful and informative. You introduced me to Kenneth Folk, who I've stayed in contact with as a teacher since. So I very much, like, in the broad sense of the term lineage, do consider us to be like part of the same family in some extended way. But I know that there's a lot of complexity around what that means and how other people interpret lineage. So I'll leave the unpacking part to you, I think, Daniel. But I did want to mention that.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate all of that. And I mean, this is a funny thing because we were all really back then, to me, in the spirit of just helping each other out. People on the path who might have different, have been doing it for a few more years than somebody else or whatever, may have read more, done a little more practice or something. But really, to me, it was always very much in the spirit of friends, even if there may have been, differences in skill sets. There was a lot of people with different skill sets helping each other out, right? So we each had skill sets that some of the others didn't have. We all tried to help each other out in those regards. And it does bring out these complex models of how people relate to spiritual families, right? Because lineage, as you mentioned, as Kenneth Folk is prone to pointing out, like it's really about family, and all the stuff that can happen in families happen in lineages. Who's in the family, who's not in the family, who's on the inside of the family, who's on the outs with the family, who's the black sheep of the family, what does family mean? And that actually, I think I've been thinking a lot about how attachment theory plays into this, like in the formal psychological sense, and thinking when I actually see how people relate to lineages and Dharma teachers and Dharma friends, how I actually think you can pretty much just kind of peg people's attachment styles related to how they relate to all of that, because I think the same dynamics play out again and again. That's not good science. That's just my empirical observation, hypothesizing. So for those not familiar with attachment theory, it's like, so kind of how you bonded to parents and felt safe or didn't, usually in early childhood, and then how that plays out and whether or not you feel securely attached or kind of anxiously or avoidantly attached. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. But the question of lineage in a Buddhist context is a really interesting one, because for a lot of history, lineage really meant the Sangha, which would be the order of monks and nuns, right? But lineage also meant the people who may have had some degree of realization. So even in the old text, you find discussions of lineage and people who had various attainments who were not yet formally members of the Sangha, but they were known as lay people to have various attainments. And then there's the question of, like, does lineage mean you can teach, or is it just that you're in the family? So, right, so lineage teachers often gets this added thing, right? It may be that monks are just, and nuns are just in the lineage, right, without, qualifiers. They're just lineaged because they're ordained, right? And then there's the question of lay people who are not formally ordained or have never been formally ordained. Are they really the same status? And then there's the question of which lineage and whose lineage. So we come from a very ambiguous set of lineages of lay people who may have various relationships to monastic life. And so, for example, like one of the most influential teachers on me, Bill Hamilton, had no formal lineage transmission in the social ritualistic sense, despite having profound realizations in the Dharma sense, which from a certain point of view, like there's the Dharma attainment of change of lineage, which in theory, just a meditative experience might make you in the lineage, right? But then if you don't have the social designation, what does that mean? And then there's the whole question, so I'm just throwing out a lot of stuff kind of shotgun style that we may riff on, of like people who were ordained and are now not ordained. Do they have the same lineage status when they disrobe as they did when they were ordained? This gets really complicated, right? And what about people who are asked to teach? Who's allowed to ask people to teach, right? And so, like, for those of us who have been asked to teach by various people, including people who are monks and nuns or who were monks and nuns, does that mean we are somehow lineaged because someone asked us to teach? And then who's allowed to do that? This all gets very, very complicated and political, and the practical implications of this are actually also complicated to sort out. So is it crucial that people have the social designations or the rituals or the official certifications, or is it just important that people have good wisdom to share? And these are complicated topics. And then some people's question of, like, authenticity, it's very important to them that they have a sense of what is authentic, truly connected, truly certified. And then there are other people who could care less, and it's really just a question of what helps end suffering, right? And then so you have competing priorities and competing aesthetics. And I'm just going to stop there because that was a lot. Sorry.
Sure. No, that was great. And there's a lot of things you said there that I have questions about. And even as to where you, Vince, and where you, Daniel, stand on some of those subjects. So I guess in the sense of lineage, right, there's some like Dharma transmission. And again, and with the 21st century Dharma kind of theme is, are there even Dharma heirs anymore? Like these days, how does that even work? Like,
Yeah,
is
and of
there,
whom? Right, that's
right?
another question.
Yeah, right. So Daniel, you're, yeah, I mean, where would you plot your Dharma lineage, or how would you say that or qualify it? You know what I mean? Like, from coming from you, how do you understand it?
So this is really complicated. So the first thing is, the thing I personally, from my own aesthetics, consider to be most important is the meditative experiences that convey some direct appreciation of something that other people can recognize about their own sensate reality that reduces suffering, right? So that's a critical thing, regardless of what you call it. If you call it path attainments or bhumis or, Kensho or Satori or whatever you call fancy words you call these things, that there is some experience. So actually, in my own life, I care about the experiences more. But it's not that the social aspects aren't important. They can be very important. But so, in the 90s, I started, well, actually, there's a Buddhist text somewhere that says anybody above the arising and passing away actually would have the minimum requirements of a teacher, which is a stage I crossed into when I was a teenager. It would have been ridiculous for me to teach when I was a teenager who had no idea what this experience was and just found it confusing to have taught at that point. That would have been absurd from my point of view, but who knows? So the minimum requirements are actually something that I know people who were young kids when this stuff happened to them, and they should be able to teach. I don't know. And then there's another tradition I spent a lot of time in where they like people to be, sort of certified as second path. That's the Mahasi tradition, before they would allow them to generally teach, which is a somewhat moderately sophisticated, sort of mid-grade awakening from a sort of a Theravadan Buddhist point of view. But then there are all kinds of problems, like how does this relate to, I know people who have woken up in what I think of as a very old school technical sense, who never even meditated and are not even a part of any tradition. Right. And so then what do you do with those people? These are just questions that are being raised by this. If they have valid experience that they can, from their own experience, talk about aspects of reality they can point to that will help others reduce their suffering, then, what do you do with them from a formal lineage point of view? And we get into these tensions between the sort of controlling orthodox hierarchies and the people who may just have seen something very important and transformative about their experience. And even the question of transmission is a funny one. Like, of people who have transmitted to me, like if I started going through that list of people I felt like I got some kind of download from, it's an absurdly large list of, like, they shared some wisdom with me that impacted me in a positive way that I can then hopefully help to try to explain to someone else. Right. That list is absurdly long, and it's all kinds of people, like going back to like teachers in grade school that helped me reduce suffering, and parents, and like all of the people that help. If the project is about reducing suffering, increasing wisdom, and that's really should be the metric, right, for Four Noble Truths and that kind of stuff, then the list of people who transmitted to me is absurd, right, absurdly large. And so, and then or do I like just single out a few people who kind of artificially, like, I think of myself as being in the lineage of Bill Hamilton. It would be absurd for me to say that I wasn't from some point of view. And yet Bill Hamilton never really during his lifetime thought I had a level of realization that would be worthy of that. And yet Kenneth Folk, who very much feels he's in lineage of Bill Hamilton, thinks I do. And so you get into these very weird things, right, of what does this mean? Or like another strange one. So for example, Christopher Titmuss, I was having a walk with him at Gaia House 22 years ago now, summer of 1999, I think. And I said, who do you consider a lineage Dharma teacher? And he said a lineage Dharma teacher is someone who has been asked to teach retreats solo. Well, that's an interesting criteria. It wasn't the answer I was expecting at all. And so I've been asked to teach, meditation retreats by various people and have. Does that make me a lineage teacher? Well, I also know people who have been asked to teach retreats who, do they have that much wisdom to share from an old school technical awakening point of view? I don't know, maybe not, but like, so again, these criteria get very weird. And then you get into the sort of the weird thing of like Sayadaw U Pandita Jr. When I told him on retreat, after I had been on retreat with him for some weeks, that I was thinking of teaching again, that I had barely really taught for 6 years. while I was trying to figure out my own practice and get it up to my own standards. And he just said, good. But the thing is, that's not like a formal lineage transmission, even though it was an acknowledgement, at the moment, that perhaps I should teach. But it's the kind of thing that he probably doesn't even remember, as I was one dude on retreat with him 22 years ago, who he's never seen since and had no further contact since. Is that lineage? This gets really complicated, right? And then I have had other people from other lineages say, no, you're definitely in our lineage just because of what you can do and know. So, for example, someone from a Western magical order said, you're definitely a member of certain lineage just because of what you're understood, even if you've never studied in our tradition and had never even heard of it, because our tradition, in theory, encompasses anybody who would have that level of technical attainment. So so these are the curious ambiguities of the path. I'm just going to kind of stop there. Vince, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about like some kind of meta frameworks that I'm kind of employing to make sense of a lot of the different stuff that you're throwing out there. And, like to me, there's almost two sides to what we're talking about. We're kind of talking about like the kinds of lineage, and then we're talking about who decides who's in and who's out, and how you're in and how you're out. And to me, like the kinds of lineage we've kind of circled around, like there's here I'll use like a model from one of my other mentors, Ken Wilber. He talks about the first, second, and third person perspectives as like key perspectives that you have to include if you want to like take account of a lot of different ways of seeing. And for him, like the first person perspective on lineage is realization. It's like the actual realization that you have. And I think, Daniel, you're speaking to that as like, that's one of your primary focuses, really. And that's how I've always experienced you as well. That change of lineage moment is kind of like, I remember you telling me about that, talking about that, how that in a way could be seen as the first person lineage, like your own experience of entering the lineage. And if you have that, regardless of who's tapped you shoulder or whatever, what you've read, like that's sufficient from that point of view. But then there's the second person perspective on lineage, which is like more the cultural or social aspect of like the relationships. And that's, I think, where the family dynamics come into play, and it gets kind of messy. And there's also, for me, a lot of love and a lot of like, there's the good side of the messiness as well in there. The deep relationships and, like the moments on the path that really fucking matter. Like when I was melting down from a mushroom trip, and I could call up Daniel and be like, hey man, I'm melting down and I'm getting ready to host a conference in like 3 days. Can you please help?
Thank you.
True story. So there's that. And then there's the institutional lineage, which is the third person perspective. And it's like looking at like this, almost like the systems view. And I remember, it's like people inherit lineages sometimes because they're really good at like managing organizations, and they're really good at like raising money and like bringing the voice of the original teacher to a broader audience. And so they get, that's honored as part of what lineage is as well by most living lineages, I think. Otherwise, they probably are dead if they don't focus on the institutional side of things. And then to me, there's the question of who decides. Who decides who's in the lineage? And I know traditionally it's almost always a top-down decision, like someone in a position of authority determines if you're in the lineage or not. But that doesn't really fit the realization perspective of lineage. You'd have to like confirm someone's realization. Okay, then now you're in because I've confirmed it. But to me, that's cultural lineage, not the first person experience. So that's, I know traditionally speaking, how it usually is decided. But I remember, Daniel, you're speaking to kind of the peer-to-peer, kind of attitude of the Dharma Overground of like, hey, we're in this together on some fundamental level. We're equals, even if we have different levels of skill and different depth of realization. So to me, there's also like peers can decide if you're in a lineage or not. Like that's actually true. If you hang out with enough people who are lineage holders and like, hey, we see eye to eye. It's like, well, so because the person in your family tree didn't give you the tap on the shoulder, does that mean you're not actually equals with these people? Like, no. By any like reasonable definition, if someone who's really skilled and competent considers you an equal, you're an equal. And then there's another part of this, which is like the bottom up decision. And I remember talking to Hokai, our old friend Hokai, about this a number of years ago. And he asked me, like, who makes a teacher? You know, is it the teacher's teacher that makes them a teacher? Is it their, you know, is it their peers, or is it their students? And he's, in his perspective at the time was, it's actually your students that make the most difference. Like, if no one comes up to you and asks you for anything or asks you to teach, and you're like, you've got a sign on the door, you've got a, you know, you've got your enlightenment scroll or whatever, and no one shows up, like, are you really a teacher? And likewise, if you don't have that scroll and a bunch of people show up and they found what you're sharing helpful and it makes a difference for them, you know, like, is that person a teacher? Yeah, I think they are a teacher, you know, by my understanding of what lineage is. So to me, those are kind of two things that have to be looked at: who decides, and like what are the different kinds of lineage. So in the ways that really matter, I do consider you, Daniel, to be a lineage teacher, in the sense that, like, I found your work helpful. I came and sought out your advice. It was helpful. And other people have also found it helpful. So it continues to be helpful for others. So to me, it's like, yeah, that's obviously someone who has demonstrated real world wisdom. And so to me, yeah, that's a lineage holder.
Well, then,
yeah.
Yeah, and you know, a question from there would be, say Daniel is, I guess, a lineage holder. You know, does that lineage end with him, or his students carry that on? How does that work? Especially in the 21st century. Well,
Right.
exactly. Well, what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm an outsider, so I'm on the outside looking at this thing, and I'm saying, okay, so wait, is there, in the 21st century, I mean, at least from my point of view, I see less and less like Dharma transmissions as, okay, this person is this person's student, so they are now teaching this, or they just kind of go on and do their own thing. Like, in the 21st century, are there still Dharma heirs, or is the, at least in the Western world, is you know, the Dharma teachings, or, you know, awakening teachings, however you want to call it, changing?
Some big questions, James.
I mean, I don't know. That's why I have two experts on right here. You got Vince and Daniel. You guys,
we're trying to establish where our expertise comes from. I don't know.
Yeah. So what do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, I think well, I mean, the Dharma is huge, right? And so in traditional countries, I think you're still, you know, and which generally means, you know, Eastern, then, and Asian, particularly, you still got all the traditional lineage stuff, which is going on and will go on, and will probably go on for centuries if we can avoid destroying the planet, right? So, and maybe millennia, because it seems to be unusually robust to wars, to changes, to complexities, to different governments, the system of the way lineage works. And, you know, and that's actually, there are vastly more people in that system in terms of monks and nuns than there are in the West. So, like, in terms of just from a planetary point of view, my guess is that continues, and that continues based on all the things it's been based on, and this varies by the country. Sometimes it's by family, sometimes it's by ordination, sometimes it's by institution, and I think those are all alive and well, and will be. And I think in the West, loosely speaking, although there's cross-pollination, right, the geographical boundaries are not hard on this by any means, but obviously it's an incredibly new experiment with a large degree of transformation and figuring itself out, and very much in flux. I would be astounded if in 50 to 100 years it looked a tremendous amount like it does today, because I think it's still very much figuring itself out. This is, again, ignoring planetary threats and existential crisis, right? This is assuming planetary stability for those kinds of conversations, which is probably not true. But anyway, so and so I think in the West, it's very hard to say even what it is, because there's so many now different strains and vibes and things going on, right? So you have, from a certain point of view, there may have been never been more lay teachers that have been created than, say, out of the Spirit Rock teacher training program, which is just massive, or, you know, assistant teachers out of the Goenka tradition, or, you know, and these various models. And then, but there's this complicated question of how did those large numbers of lay teachers that were being created relate to the traditional systems, right? So if you're a certified teacher or training person from someone who used to be a monk, but you're not trained in a traditional thing, but yet you are trained by one of the major Western insight meditation centers, where does that fit you in the sort of grander historical context? This is really complicated, right? Vince, actually having been through that, would probably be vastly more qualified to speculate on that and to talk about what it means and what it doesn't, and how that will look going forward, right? And the emphases in these traditions have really been in the creation of large numbers of people with extremely high degrees of sort of psychological and cultural sensitivity, rather than necessarily on realization. But those, from a certain point of view, may be incredibly helpful for our society, because we obviously have a profound need for basic meditation stuff to meet a lot of people where they are in their psychological and sociocultural and trauma needs, right? Which are very real, as you run into again and again. So creating those kinds of teachers en masse, may be incredibly skillful. Vince, I'm just going to stop there. Vince, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple. I mean, one is that it's very hard for me having one foot in the insight meditation tradition world, to see, is insight meditation its own form? Is it a Western form of Dharma, or is it just a transitory form that was eventually leading to mindfulness? Because right now there's a lot of like very blurry overlap between those worlds and how people are teaching that have trained in the insight meditation world. And I think that's interesting, because if you take something like Jack Kornfield and Tara Brach's mindfulness meditation teacher certification training, which now has had thousands of people go through it, a magnitude of order more than they had trained in the previous insight meditation tradition, then you see something like the yogification of Dharma or mindfulness, depending on how you understand those terms.
When you say yogification, is that worth defining?
Yeah, so that would be like what happened in the yoga world a few decades ago as like the teacher training industry exploded, and and you had probably a lot of traditional practitioners of yoga who'd spent time in India going, "Oh my God, I can't believe what they're doing to the tradition, just watering it down." And yet, here we are, like there's a yoga center on every block. And how many people do you know that are yoga teachers? Like personally, I know so many. I think most people know at least one person who's done yoga teaching of some kind. So I think that seems to be where we're heading with mindfulness. And yet I'm not sure the mindfulness world is clear on its, some parts of the mindfulness world aren't clear themselves on whether they're teaching Dharma or they're teaching some kind of secular,
Yeah.
modern friendly version of meditation. And I don't think that's clear at all if you actually go into mindfulness teaching contexts and hear what people are saying, because they're using often Pali words, and they're in some ways they're more traditional Dharma teachers than I am, and yet they're secular mindfulness teachers, or
Yeah.
at least that they're operating under that banner. So to me, that there's the mindfulness question as well, and how that relates to Dharma. That's like hard to avoid with these things, and the insight teachers have done more than most lineages, I think, to try to adapt a lot of the stuff they were handed into Western culture. So that's probably in part why it led to the mindfulness movement. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have good answers, to that question.
Well, then, for Vince, I want to ask you. You did the Jack Kornfield and Spirit Rock training and all
Okay.
that.
Okay, now
So,
we're going to get into the politics, because I didn't actually.
oh,
I received I was part of a lineage authorization ceremony, a public one with Jack and Trudy. But in the years prior to that, I had been invited along with my wife Emily to attend a 4-year retreat teacher training, which is kind of the highest training that they do in that system. And I filled out my application. I shared with them my background and my influences, including Daniel and Kenneth and Bill, and so my understanding was this was an application just to kind of formalize things, like like almost no one was going to be rejected, or if anyone. And
yeah.
yet Jack got back to me and said, sorry, they didn't like that you were connected to Daniel.
Wow.
And I'm sharing this now publicly for the first time. Like, this is stuff that I've been sitting on for a decade. And I thought it was so absurd just on the surface of things, and so counter to the kind of just the principles and practices of Dharma. I was very naive at that time too, I'll say.
Yeah.
And I was torn apart by that. And I went back to Trudy and Jack, and I was like, what in the fuck is this about? And Trudy actually fought for me, and she said, Jack, you need to go back there and tell them that this is wrong. And he did. And then they invited me actually into the teacher training, and I said, fuck you. No.
Wow.
So, because because of the how things went down. So Emily ended up doing this teacher training, and I did not. And I decided like what I knew was sufficient. I felt confident to be able to teach without that. But yeah, it was a very painful introduction to the politics that happened behind the scenes in these worlds. And like, if you're associated with someone that isn't orthodox, like that actually can keep you from being part of the orthodox. And it's incredible how myopic in some ways I think Dharma people can be to the institutional politics that are at play in these things. Like I don't know, that we just are so focused maybe on our own subjective phenomena that we don't maybe clue in as much to like the reality of the world and these things. But yeah, it was a real wake up call to me that like what's going on here is not just about realization, about what you have to offer. It's also about who you know, and if you know the right kinds of people. And so yeah, that's unfortunately I'm not part of that lineage in that way. Like I got grandparented in by Trudy and Jack.
Yeah.
Wow. So, yeah. Dang, I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that. That's
yeah.
It's not surprising, but it's still like heavy.
Yeah.
But yeah, what can you do?
It's sad.
Yeah, it's interesting. As sort of similar thing with well, it's not quite like that, but the Western. It was just at the International Western Dharma Teachers Gathering some weeks ago, and there was the Gen X Dharma Teachers group, and they had a discussion, and it was an open forum and discussion. And I raised the question of like, hey, I was rejected from a previous application some years ago to go to your conference because they didn't consider me a Gen X Dharma teacher, which is very interesting. And I was like, okay. And it's because of the ambiguities of things related to lineage around me. And so I put it back to them and I said, well, hey, is this, as a group, you're allowed to have your criteria be whatever they want, obviously, I have tremendous respect for people wanting to set whatever standards they care about. But do you understand the implications of doing that? And so it's interesting, they got back to me and they added some more standards that actually make me even less one. So now I don't meet their criteria on 2 counts, which was one that I don't spend the majority of my workday teaching Dharma. I spend the majority of my workday running a charity and do maybe 10 to 15 hours a week of stuff that might be considered Dharma teaching in some context, but it's not the majority. The majority of probably 35 hours or 40 hours is running a charity, which is designed to internationally upgrade the experience of people going through what I would consider Dharma or meditation or spiritual or whatever experiences in the clinical mainstream, but it's not Dharma teaching. So now, curiously enough, after I got back to them, they revised their criteria to exclude me on 2 counts rather than 1. But one of the most interesting things about that was they also have a criteria in there that is responsible to, you're responsible to someone else, meaning that there's someone else who is giving you oversight, which is one of the other important criteria, right? Because I think there are teachers without oversight that there's no whatever, and then they can get into trouble and no one's paying attention and can do anything about it. And we hear these stories again and again. But it's interesting. I was actually thinking, like, who am I responsible to? Like, the Dharma Overground community gives me all kinds of flack sometimes for stuff I do. Like, there are plenty of criticism, and I feel in some ways responsible to this, now almost 10,000 person community. Not that there are that many active at any time, but I think we have about 10,000 members and have been for 13 years. And then, like, there's my whole peer group that, I'm intimately involved with as, on sometimes daily and weekly basis, of people such as yourself, Vince, and you, James, and all kinds of people who are just, we're paying attention to what everybody's doing, what what they're putting out there and what happens with, and there is responsibility. And then there's like the law, like, so we're all responsible to the court systems and the law, right? And I was thinking through this, and could there actually be anybody who was responsible to no one? And what would you actually have to exist like in this day and age where the world of social media or the world of something wasn't going to come down upon your head if you screwed up or they perceived you screwing up? Like, you'd have to be living under a rock in a cave, like in Antarctica, but even still has legal jurisdiction on it or something, so like maybe out in the open waters, but even there's international law. And thinking like, who is truly responsible to nobody? Like, it's a funny criteria to think about. Anyway, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I mean, I do want to shift gears though a little bit, and getting into the lineage aspect of Bill Hamilton, because I knew Bill himself was training with U Pandita, right,
for years,
the Mahasi lineage. So I think Daniel, maybe you have the greatest insight into this about, say, let's talk about Bill Hamilton and his lineage.
He had no formal like institutional lineage transmission.
Okay.
So from a third person point of view, he did not have that, which is wild because he's one of the most badass practitioners I'd ever met, and with a profound and deep, decades of incredible dedication to Dharma practice and learning and incredible teaching. So, but he didn't have third person lineage institutional recognition. He obviously had second person lineage because he taught some people, but it was actually a strangely small number. Although from a certain point of view, from his work with the Dharma Seed Tape Library, like, this is another interesting thing to promote the Dharma. If one as a teacher is one who promotes the Dharma, like, then even Vince, like, if you weren't another kind of Dharma teacher, Buddhist Geeks, like, for example, does tremendous Dharma promotion. Right, it's sort of this collective promotion of a staggering amount of wisdom and other people. Like, so is to to teach Dharma, to promote the Dharma, and does that have to be even you saying it? Is the so like Bill's work through the Dharma Seed Tape Library eventually created this platform where there's thousands and thousands of teachings by teachers that he put out there. Like, is that Dharma teaching? Well, from a certain point of view, functionally, of course it is, right? And the promotion of wisdom that hopefully reduces suffering. And so he did that. So second person, he had it. And first person, I have no doubt that he had profound levels of realization and, died an arahant or whatever. Some people would freak out about that designation, how it was used and who's designated, and want to fight about those terms and get all petty and political about it, or, maybe a very important, I don't know. So, but then, like, he definitely had that from my point of view, but he never got the institutional recognition, which is a weird one, right? And because he never had the political skills, he wasn't willing to play the games, he was too outspoken, and he just didn't have the social skills, right? And he was also training with monks that at the time, no, a lineage teacher is a monk or nun, really, but mostly monks, right? Let's be realistic. So, then, and since he wasn't one, then he would never be able to have the formal lineage status. And there is this sort of still kind of important institutional mystique or power about the notion of formal ordination, right? Which has this mythic resonant quality. So yeah, but but then looking at it from another point of view, like, Ram Dass was taught by him and he taught Ram Dass, like, they helped each other out on the path as kind of Dharma brothers or whatever. And so, like, the people who taught, Ram Dass, was he getting teachings from them, from his teachers, right? So he in their lineage? And he studied with all kinds of other complicated figures and gurus, and he studied, Chogyam Trungpa and all this stuff. Like, is he in their lineage? Well, from a certain point of view, of course he is, right? Because he synthesized their wisdom and was able to retransmit it in a way that was effective for some people. So of course he's in their lineage, and the lineage of all the interesting people he wandered around and studied with. Of course, it'd be absurd to say not, and yet institutionally, definitely not, right? So is he in a Vedanta lineage? Is he in a Tantric lineage? Is he in a Mahayana lineage? Is he a Theravada lineage? Well, I think of course, and multiple ones, and then other people. But and then there's really reality is what teaches us all, right? Sort of the earth witness point of view, right? So it's reality, it's our sensate experience, it's this world that teaches us, right? Is the greatest teacher. We learn not from just from theory, but from also the experience of this, that kind of earth witness, putting your hand on the ground, saying, I, have the right to claim this level of understanding, and to, that we're all in the lineage of just experiential reality, because that's really what's showing us, right? And to deny that would seem to not consider that as the primary thing would seem absurd to me from most points of view.
Yeah, for sure. And I understand that, especially because not in all like yoga teachings, but some of them will say the only true guru is the ultimate reality unveiling itself to you.
Right, of course.
So that is the ultimate teacher. But yeah, and also, Bill Hamilton was very influential on Shinzen Young. And Shinzen has said, like stuff he teaches, he's taught over the years, and that he put into his unified mindfulness teaching program. Some stuff is influenced by Bill Hamilton.
And Shinzen also influenced Bill. So is Bill in a Shingon lineage, a Zen lineage, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and what other so Bill Hamilton, he studied with other people other than U Pandita so I guess and I really wish, again, Bill was gonna possibly write those several books on his Dharma teachings. I wonder what would have came out in there that may have not been totally Mahasi. So I mean, I guess we can extrapolate a little in the sense where you wrote Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, and some of your influence was from Bill Hamilton.
Oh yeah.
And so and so some of your influence from Bill Hamilton, is there some of it you can point to it and say, well, that's not really Theravada nor Mahasi in that way?
Right. So this is another question. Sorry, I'm taking up a lot of bandwidth here. Right. Every single lineage that exists today basically is some reform or deviation from something that came before. And even the attempts to go back and reconstruct what was truly the earliest Buddhist Sangha, you're going to run into the fact that there was endless debate about even what that was, and there was at the time. And even all of those people were coming from subtly different influences or different teachers, right? So the Buddha studied with a bunch of teachers before him who taught him all kinds of jhanic stuff and renunciate practices and all kinds of things, right? And then a lot of the wandering aesthetics that woke up under the Buddha also had studied from other teachers, which clearly contributed to their awakening and their realization and their understanding and the way they taught. So even at the time, there was tremendous controversy and discussion and debate. It was always this robustly debated thing. And even the Theravada, I think there was like 13 or so major lineages of it, of which only, the early stuff, like only really one, I guess the Theravada sort of version of it or variant of it has survived, but there were a bunch of others. And so, and everybody today, like Thai forest Buddhism versus everybody's a variant from something. So as you go back down the sort of evolutionary tree and try to trace back to like the single source, you actually can't find it. What you find is more tree. What you find is more roots and branches. And so like this sort of business of like invalidating other lineages and forms of transmission of the Dharma, as soon as you start that game, you would literally have to cut off the whole tree, right? Because like, you can't find a single perfect source, period. I'm sorry, like I don't mean to contradict all the textual scholars who are trying. I appreciate their attempts. It's a fascinating business to see what's pin the tail on the oldest sutta, or whatever. It's a fun game to play as you wander around blind with a stick or whatever, or something as piñatas. Never mind. And so, but like, every lineage that exists, all of the Mahayana lineages, they're all some sort of reform or variant. And so at the time, they all received pushback. and then eventually we're accepted as something. So there's also this kind of generational temporal morphing component where in our own era, things that today are probably considered very controversial may be institutional at some point, and then there will be reform against them. It's almost, and so that's just the natural cycle of orthodoxies.
Yeah. And, that's kind of one of the ideas that I was talking about, the 21st century Dharma.
Mhm.
It's yeah, exactly your point. And, trying to trace it back. I see a lot of teaching in the West where there's no more, like, I don't want to name any names, but so if there was, or here's an example, because I'm not down talking anybody, but say Joseph Goldstein, right, is teaching at IMS, and now is he transmitting the Dharma for other people to continue that lineage? And is that the IMS lineage, or is it the Mahasi lineage, or right? And
Right, because
I'm
even though he's ordained or authorized to teach by Upandita, I think is the person that gave him, said you can teach, and I think he's got some others as well. I don't know. I can't. Did Trungpa say as well? I
Don't
can't
know.
remember. Yeah. So, but I think actually he may have a few. I'm not sure of the social designations, but yeah, it is also true that what is being taught at IMS is an amalgam of their best attempt to synthesize what works for their audience and the people coming to them and what they feel is the safest and best and most effective, right? And they're trying to optimize for their own vision of what they feel is the right Dharma for that setting and that audience. And of course, it looks really, in some ways, it's got some traditional Mahasi elements, but in other ways, it's very, very different and a fusion of a lot of things. And so does that invalidate the lineage if you don't do exactly what the people before you did? Is that the same lineage, right? These are these, again, it's so organic as this organic moving thing, right? And it always has been. That's the thing. This has never been fixed. If you read the history of, say, Tibetan Buddhism or Zen, it's this endless sort of debates and conversation. And I think it's only by being an alive, robust, moving, morphing thing that is constantly grappling with new social forces, contexts, languages, cultural settings, and all of that, that you can have something that is really robust and works. With hopefully some sense of what are the essential elements, realizing that is clearly up for debate. Right?
Yeah. And so Vince, you have experienced, I guess, working with Daniel and with Jack Cornfield a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I guess I don't see how that works now. Yeah, with the Dharma lineage thing. I think I don't know, especially having this conversation, it seems like it's almost like an idea or formality of sorts. It's a very person thing. Considering in the grand scheme of things, where as the Dharma, again, like what you're saying, Daniel, eliminating suffering and the fundamentals of it, versus the personal aspects of it. So Vince, what do you make of that?
Yeah, no, I'm really appreciative, Daniel, for you framing this in terms of evolution, because I think that's a much better frame to understand lineage than what seems like it's almost like a lot of lineage is like trying to reify some conceptual kind of view of what, like a snapshot of how things are and in the moment. And what, like you said, that the evolutionary or evolving, the organic aspect of this is like you can do that, but then it's like how, and then 2 months later it's out of date. The snapshot's out of date. It's like, how do you actually have a view or a kind of a symbolic representation of what's actually happening? I think that's the challenge in lineage in some ways, is like we're very bad at coming up with models that accurately reflect what's happening in the world. We try, and we're not even doing it in a very scientific way with Buddhist lineage. So it's just like, a lot of it is power. I think power play stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately. But yeah, the evolutionary view of like looking at these different things as variants, as Buddhism as this tradition of adaptation, which is kind of the story it has about itself, especially in the modern Buddhisms. It's like Buddhism is a thing that adapts to every place it goes. That's one of its characteristics. until it's your lineage, and then it's like it stops right there.
Well, actually,
And then, just one last point here. The part of evolution to me that I've learned about is like recombination. That's one of the key elements. And for me, I trained with Daniel and Kenneth, and I got this sort of particular flavor of Dharma. It was even between the two of them very different, but then working with Jack and Trudy is like, oh, this is another flavor. And to me, it was like actually trying to sincerely work with both views of what Dharma was, actually had the impact in my own experience of a kind of synthesis, I think, in how I understood things and now how I teach things. So that recombination, it's like divergence is great for evolution in terms of like if you can actually recombine elements in ways that work, and it meets, and it gives you an advantage for being like for filling a niche. There's somewhere in the ecology of things that this works and people or find this valuable, then it's going to prosper and it's going to work. And to me, it's like part of why the insight tradition, in a way, I think it's at a phase maybe of its own development where there's a lot of homogeneity within the cultures, within these cultures. I think that's changing, but when I was there, for sure there was like this kind of cultural homogeneity. I think that's why Bill wasn't part of the crew, because he was so different. He was like this eccentric dude, this Dharma dude, and he just didn't fit the mold of like what an insight meditation teacher was at the time, which is a pretty narrow mold. It was like, this is what it has to look like. This is how you have to kind of behave. This is how you look. That, I think that has changed. Like there has been some reckoning within that community about the homogeneity of itself. But to me, it's like that recombination and that natural evolution is a better way of looking at lineage than than like looking at like the like what do they have in big companies? They've got like the org charts. It's like, here's the org charts. Like, good luck keeping the org chart up to date. It's hard.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say it's part of the lineage, in a sense, like a set of techniques and philosophy. Where does that come into the equation?
Well, that's really complicated, actually. So like, even within like things that would seem very similar, like variants of Dzogchen, right? There's going to be subtleties, or Yogacara philosophy, Mahamudra. These debates about like the subtlest layers of what is, like subtle questions of ontology that seem so abstract and esoteric, have split entire traditions, even if they looked incredibly similar in nearly everything. And so there's something called the narcissism of small differences, which is apparently a religious scholarship thing, where like I've mentioned Belgium and Holland saying, we're so different, and maybe they really are, I don't know, but like a lot of the world looks at them and you're kind of similar, but I don't know, sorry for people of Belgium and Holland who are quite sure you're very different. Maybe you are. I'm totally ignorant here, but you see what I mean? Like, or the Baptist Convention of 1860, whatever, versus 1870 or something, to the rest of the world, they all look incredibly similar, but these nuances of distinction, no, it's this thing, and this subtle point of doctrine is critical. And it's interesting how these things become so important, and maybe they are. I don't mean to say that subtle points of Dharma and dogma and things might not be credibly important for some people. They might be critical sometimes, but it's also the kind of thing where it's pretty much guaranteed, as the voice gets transmitted to new humans, just like the telephone game, that things will change. That's just going to happen. So if you look at the Thai forest tradition, these people all look really, really different. Like, Achan Mun versus Buddhadasa or whatever, they look really, really different. And yet we sort of lump them all together as Thai forest, right? Even though like, they're, and, even Burmese, we say, oh, Burmese Buddhism, but like, Goenka stuff versus, Mahasi stuff versus Pa Auk stuff. They look really, really different in a lot of ways, right? So, U Ba Khin, and even U Ba Khin, right? He taught all these people, they end up looking really different in some ways, because he kind of taught them all different things, because they were all different people and needed stuff, right? And so it's just, and so this constant branching, the instant you transmit to someone else, is the dynamic force that, as you very well put it, is sort of in an ecological system, then sort of like, going in this dynamic tension between diversifying and then reconvergence, and diversifying and reconvergence. And that's just the nature of this thing. But even when it reconverges, it may reconverge in totally different ways and combinations. It's kind of like viruses, like the influenza virus with all these little parts of it that recombine and form something else that may be more or less contagious. I think the Dharma, hopefully in a beneficial way, usually does the same thing, but not always. So I think you can also find evidence that sort of what I would consider somewhat pathological or not very helpful memes can also sometimes be propagated in that package, just because people want to preserve a package because it gives them some sense of certainty and stability and control in an uncertain world full of change and suffering, right? And so I think even the funny thing about the Dharma is its own attempts at being a solid, continuous, permanent thing, are antithetical to its own core teachings. As fascinating concepts there anyway. So, and I think attempts to often to solidify the Dharma have resulted in staggering amounts of suffering, as we see with basically all the religions. And yet there's another part of me that cannot help but appreciate the dedication to preserving something beautiful and pure and true, because I also have those parts of me that mythically love that kind of thing as well. And we're all stuck in this world where there's no way both those parts can be happy, right? It's, except at the rarest moments when whatever the mainstream or your current strain happens to converge to what you consider to be pure and true and perfect Dharma or meditation stuff in general, right? And that usually isn't what's going on. So
yeah, well, and so Vince, how do you see I guess lineage or 21st century Dharma continuing? I mean, you and Daniel, you have the Dharma Overground, and then Buddhist Geeks is really, in a way, an evolution of the Dharma, in a sense of a different way of it going out. And I guess, how do you see all that compared to, I guess, where in the East it's more contained within the lineages that way, but in the West it's almost the opposite, where it's just being kind of put out there, right? There's less and less Dharma lineage in a sense, in the way that it's going out, and anybody on the internet can just go on and find Joe or me or anybody can just go on and look up Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha or Mahasi. I can go find the Progress of Insight on the internet. So how do you see the lineage transmission or Dharma in that sense then?
Yeah, I've kind of come around on this, I guess, in recent years, come around on Dharma itself, where to me there's something incredibly valuable about the sort of original frame of this, these three trainings. And Daniel dedicates a lot of his book to describing them in terms of concentration, insight, and morality, not in that order. Morality is the first training, and the last one, as you say, Daniel. But to me, there's something about that package, which probably isn't even Buddhist itself. That was probably a yogic, an Indian yogic model that predated Buddhism, I imagine. But still, there's something about that particular coming together. And Trungpa used a slightly different translation of the three trainings. He said, it's like you're training in ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So slightly different interpretation or translation, but has a little bit of a different impact for me. To me, that it's useful to recognize that part of what modernity has been, this movement of modernity, has been in a way like meditation has become unbundled from the original package of Dharma, of these three trainings. The insight meditation tradition did a great job of that, and even the Burmese before that were kind of doing that. As Daniel, you pointed out earlier, they were doing that in a way to fight against British colonialism. They were kind of making these teachings more widely accessible, and inviting lay people to memorize the Abhidhamma and things that had never happened before. Monks were meditating all of a sudden, to protect the tradition from the encroaching colonialists. To me, that emphasis on meditation as being something that's unique in the broader place of human knowledge, and that becoming emphasized above and beyond the ethics and the awakening that the tradition offered. That's been happening, and it's found its extreme version in mindfulness, where mindfulness in ways even unbundled from meditation. You know, it's like, oh, there's this thing you can do. You don't even have to, it's not about meditation per se. Like meditation is a way of developing mindfulness. You could, but mindfulness is like, it's not owned by the traditions either. And to me, that unbundling has been exactly what's made mindfulness so popular and will make it so huge. Because it's like you've taken this like little core bit of tech, like psychotechnology, extracted it out of the tradition, and then sort of now you can like take this thing of like being aware of something. You know, it's like, okay, I'm mindful of this, and like, what can you apply that to? Well, you can apply that to anything, you know, and it does get applied to everything. Um, so I think that's one thing that I think about with the 21st century Dharma is like part of 21st century Dharma is this unbundling of like its innards have come out and have become part of this great rebundling of all this human knowledge that used to just be contained within, you know, within these packages that were held often in like monasteries, and then they got unbundled, and suddenly it's like, oh no, like the monastery isn't the only place that you can learn how to read and you can learn how to meditate and you can learn about the cosmos. Like now everyone is their own authority. And I think that's the general movement. It's like these highly centralized, bundled, packaged authorities deconstructing and getting distributed throughout everything. And in a way, I think the challenge we have to, I believe the challenge we're going to have to deal with more broadly in the 21st century is the impact of the total depersonalizing of these things, and people learning how to apply them that have no real knowledge about where these things came from or what can happen if you use them, misuse them, or use them in ways that they weren't designed for. Like there's going to be a lot of fallout, I think, from people learning mindfulness from apps and eventually doing VR things and getting into dissociative states and zapping their brains like I just did. And, you know, already people are doing psychedelics, you know, and getting into territory they don't understand. So to me, it's like there's an opportunity here, I think, for us to bring the relational element back into Dharma or a little more, like to in a way in the Dharma world invite people into human relationships again, and be able to like, hey, there's community support for this, and there's like you can talk to people about your experience and you can learn more about where these things come from. I think there's something valuable about that, even though it's really messy. And I think the messiness is part of what we have to learn how to adapt with, you know, with Dharma communities. Like, how do we be more transparent about authority and about finances? I think there's a lot we could learn from these like emerging decentralized web movements, like the Web 3.0 movements. Like how could we actually operate more like that, where we're operating in a transparent way, above board, you know, instead of all of the sort of politicking that typically comes with these things. It's unavoidable. It's like you start an institution. I'm doing this with Buddhist Geeks. You train people. You know, it's like, how many people do you train? You know, what's the criterion that you're training? Like, do you just train people because that's where the money is, or do you have like standards and, you know, things like that? So anyway, these are more of like it's more of a rant or ramble than a response to your question. But those are some of the things that came to mind.
Well, you know, actually, I did want to bring up you said you get your brain zapped. Are you able to talk about that at all?
I mean, there was not a whole lot to say, except I had a couple of researchers over here recently from the University of South Carolina, the brain stimulation, the NeuroX lab there, who developed this transcranial direct stimulator. They call it Zendo, and they claim that it has a positive impact on meditative experience. And they have like, you know, 250% reduction in whatever, increase in calm, and 33% reduction in wandering mind or whatever. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. Let me try it.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. Like, it was much more interesting to me than these sort of passive technologies I've used, like EEG, like very consumer grade EEG, because I haven't used the stuff that Daniel's got access to. But like the Muse headband, I found much less interesting than this particular device, and probably because it was actually stimulating the brain. So, you know, things like that, they're very so early on in their development, but it's easy for me to imagine a future in which people are very easily able to reliably have altered state experiences that somehow correlate or map or relate to some of the stages and states of meditation. and then just have nowhere to put the thing, like in terms of the
Yeah.
framework that they have, or they'll have whatever framework they've inherited. Um, we don't have a lot of good indigenous frameworks for this in the West, that are alive. So it's like how we're framing the meaning of these experiences, I think used to be the purview of these dharmic institutions, and now everyone's just making it up for themselves. So I think having communities where people are sense making in wiser ways and offering like a kind of path of genuine transformation with these experiences, not just like tripping out, not just having an altered state experience and be like, that was cool, man. But like,
Yeah.
oh, wow,
Yeah.
that actually changed how I look at myself and the world and my
Right.
behavior, and
Yeah.
how I'm going to
Yeah.
be. Like that to me is, where the Dharma world still could have something unique to offer, I think, to this sort of growing secularizing of all these kind of contemplative psychotechnologies, as John
Yeah.
Vervaeke.
Yeah. And I wonder if those technologies are going to get, and I don't want to speculate too much, but like say you have one of these technologies, and with one of those technologies you can bring somebody to like the arising and passing, right? Like that's almost like I don't want to say dangerous, but that's like pretty profound technology, right? I
I
mean,
want to say
seriously though, right?
dangerous,
Yeah, right. That's kind of like
I
holy
agree.
or at least
crap.
disruptive. Like,
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
There
you
you go.
know, yeah.
But Daniel, I know you have to leave soon. I wanted to ask you a question, and you can tie this into lineage in a sense. You had mentioned before a few times. I heard you mention the kind of like backroom Mahasi stuff, right? Like, oh, they'll notice like you're excelling or you're doing well, and they'll say, they'll bring you in the back room and teach you something, or some kind of like advanced teaching. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. So, what they'll teach on the front cushion in front of a bunch of people is noting and those kinds of techniques. But what they will teach in back rooms is advanced concentration stuff, jhanas, powers, yeah, basically that stuff. And
Have,
so, Naroda Samapati and things like that, and review training, aditana training, resolutions to do things for reproducibly and on command, and be able to call up states and stages and be able to get into fruitions for long periods of time. And those are the things that because the Mahasi tradition is actually quite rich. It's just not rich on the front end. It's very sort of I mean, it's much more like a package of very specific narrow range of technique stuff that will get you into deep experiences. But on the back end is actually very complicated. It's just that's not what you're going to see for most people.
and did you have firsthand experience with that?
Yeah. So for example, Bill, and also with Saito Upandita Jr. Yeah, and
And
with Kenneth Folk, who also would talk about that and being taught some of that stuff, right? And yeah,
that stuff, did any of that, or I mean, this is kind of a silly question, but how much of that went into mastering the core teachings of the Buddha?
a lot, because I thought
Yeah.
someone needs to write this stuff down.
Yeah, exactly. That's
So
because I was,
I just did the thing that they generally didn't do, which is write it down.
yeah.
I mean,
Well,
actually,
because
Mahasi wrote about a lot of cool stuff. There's a lot of cool things you can find in his writings, which are actually vastly more expensive, right? I have all these little books, my Mahasi, that you can find, and you get handed these things as you're walking out of Mahasi meditation centers in Asia. You don't see them in the West as much. So it actually, a lot of writing and stuff that we generally don't think as part of the tradition, that definitely is. So even the notion that it's sort of simple or relatively restrained set of stuff on the front end is not true. His scholastic and output was actually quite impressive on a lot of fronts, and that's not fully well represented in the West yet. But yeah, but you definitely see this where people start really talking deep meditative tech, and it becomes a much more complete sort of a thing.
yeah, because every time I hear Mahasi, I just hear Mahasi noting, and
Yeah, no, it's
I
much
look at
more
your
than that.
book and I'm like, some of this has to be part of that, especially like
Oh yeah,
when they're talking about the Vipassana jhanas and stuff. Um, you know, I hear that so little when I hear about Mahasi in a general sense.
Although it's very, if you start looking at U Pandita, that's where you start seeing that. If you read like In This Very Life and books like that, On the Path of Freedom, you'll see those kinds of things talked about. And Bill was way into that stuff. And then apparently Kundala and Ujjanika Bhavamsa, also definitely teachers who would talk about those sorts of things. And Sada U Pandita Jr., the younger one, would also talk about powerful concentration states and stages, and would talk a little bit about powers and talk about deeper levels of realization and things. And so it's there. It's just that's not what you see on the front end.
Yeah, that's not what you're gonna generally learn at IMS, right?
I was gonna say IMS and Spirit Rock to me are really similar, Daniel. Like the culture where I remember being on a 2-month at Spirit Rock, and at the end of the retreat, some other retreatant who'd done 2 months as well came up and asked me what I was, about my retreat, and I said, "Oh, I was working on this, and this practice." They're like, "What? That wasn't what was being taught." And they had this idea that like everyone was doing the thing that the people at the front of the stage were telling us to do. And yeah, I knew there were a lot of people there that had, independent practices and were doing things and still getting support, and even getting like quote unquote advanced teachings or whatever. So it seems like maybe that cultural thing is the same. There's still a kind of a back room within the insight world where it's like some people know that you can do all these other things and other people don't realize that and think it's just the thing that's being presented.
Yeah. It would be like if people in early grade school didn't know that there was college and grad school and then industry and academia after that. It's what it feels like to me, as if everybody thought you just lived in 5th grade forever or whatever.
Yeah, because that's exactly what I was going to ask, is if IMS and Spirit Rock actually taught those kind of things.
I think some of the teachers do, but I don't. It seems like a lot of that teaching does happen. It's not on the front of the stage per se, because not everyone wants to hear about some of these things, I guess, right off the bat, or they just haven't. Yeah, people haven't. They found it's not palatable, I imagine, for a lot of folks when they're have a 100-person retreat every few weeks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I actually have tremendous sympathy for them. And I think about the analogy, I was thinking about like these one-room schoolhouses that existed out on the prairie or in plenty of places where you were teaching, kids from like 6 to 17 or whatever in the same classroom. How in the world do you do that, and do something that's appropriate for people at such radically different stages of learning and development? Or even, at least there you would get to see that there was a range of development. Whereas what this often does is they kind of cut off the high end, which is, they cut off the highs, lows, and weirds, basically.
It's like the compression. It's like compression on
it is
audio.
Very much, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And is there an issue? I don't want to say an issue, but is that a challenge going forward where there may not be as many deeply experienced Dharma teachers and with the growing kind of interest and need in that kind of stuff?
Well, it's funny, like I see no end of them. I can't keep up with them all. Like when you hang out a shingle and say you'll talk about the deep weird end of stuff, like you get all these people. Right?
Yeah.
I can't even remember all their names. Like, and these people with incredible talent and meditative capabilities who've done tons of retreat time and really plunged deep or had some natural capacity on smaller amounts to go deep. I know lots of these people. I literally can't remember them all. And they're out there and they network together, and I try to connect them into this network of people who care about this stuff, right? And that's what makes sense to them. That's what they resonate with. That seems, and so they're out there, but the vast majority also do not want to be public is the other thing. So the incredibly harmful thing about the taboos and the sort of lineage, dominance, toxicity, and all of that kind of stuff, as well as just the sort of Dharma that doesn't want to deal with the highs, lows, and weirds, is that you end up being cut off from a tremendous amount of talent that just does not want to take the public ridicule and the criticism. I mean, you've got to have some pretty tough skin to be out there about this stuff. And anybody who's looked at the reactions to some of the stuff I've posted on Twitter or on forums, or read comments on my YouTube videos, there's nearly always some toxic, snarky, whatever. And what people also don't realize is that, when you get to see what people, what happens when you stick your heads up above the battlements and how many arrows start flying, what you don't then see is the number of people who are never going to stick their heads up above the battlements. And one of them might have actually been a great teacher for you, the person putting out the toxic, snarky stuff. And you just were never going to meet them because they're not going to come out of the closet. So
yeah. And those, a lot of those people are not tied to lineages, right? They're kind of just hardcore,
not in the third
solo
person sense, but in the second person sense and first person sense, definitely.
Yeah, they're kind of just solo hardcore practitioners that are, with that in mind, what do you think about people that are not included in lineages, right? So they're people that have maybe picked up mastering the hardcore teachings of the Buddha, or they're kind of just listening to the Buddhist Geeks podcast, and they're running into territory. What do you advise for people like that to do, where they're not part of a lineage, they don't have an official teacher, so to speak, but they're again, they're researching and they're practicing, and they run into AMP or stream entry or disillusion, or all these kind of the progress of insight stuff.
Daniel, do you want to jump in since your time's limited here?
All right, cool. I'll jump in. So reach out to people who know this stuff. And there's lots of places to find this. There's a lot of forums. There's the Dharma Overground and its sister forums. There's a bunch of teachers out there. There are meditation centers. There may even be local monasteries that you don't even recognize in your own community. It's funny, Dhammarato has been talking a lot with me about encouraging people to try to connect with their local Asian Dharma centers, because there's this incredible disconnect between the sort of traditional Asian centers in the West and sort of Western Dharma, where a lot of people may not realize that you might actually have very competent teachers and practitioners, even in your local temples, that seem kind of superficially ritualistic, but actually in practice may have some real talent or know where real talent is. And then there's the whole transpersonal world of like various maps and models through transpersonal psychology, which has its own various ways of looking at some of these energetic or archetypal or whatever openings. But just community, that's the critical thing. And so, again, that's why Vince and I originally created the Dharma Overground, is we were realizing there were all these people who wanted to have these conversations and were having these experiences, and there were not safe spaces for that. Vince, do you have other suggestions?
Yeah, no, I think what you said makes a lot of sense. I mean, to me, there's a lot more places people can tap in now than there were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, for sure. Yeah, with the internet, there's been a proliferation of that. So in a way, it's much better now than it used to be, but it's still challenging. So yeah, I think those are the things you mentioned are pretty basic stuff, like reach out, connect, talk to real people. Find some real people to talk to, whether it's on a forum or over the phone or Zoom, or if you can do it in person, that's even better.
Yeah, and if the EPRC project is successful, hopefully one day the mainstream mental health and clinical systems will have substantially upgraded data-driven understandings that will allow them to add a whole lot more value to care and support of these things. Because again, as these things are scaling globally, we have to have a mental health care system and a general healthcare system that can scale globally with them in terms of appreciation of these things. So if you're interested in the EPRC, check us out at theeprc.org. That's theeprc.org. Thank you so much for allowing the shameless plug of the research group that I'm helping to support.
Yeah, and I'll put the link in the description as well. And Daniel, I know you got to go. So Vince and Daniel, starting with Daniel, do you have any last words to the audience overall about lineage and or 21st century Dharma.
Yeah, just keep your wits about you and see what really does help you lead a better, more suffering-free, happier life. If something's making you really angry or contracted or whatever, just look at that. If something's making you feel like, hey, no, this is honestly helpful, just look at that, and be willing to be flexible in that, and thoughtful, and follow the organic path that your life goes down, because we may come into lots of different relationships with these things at various times, and that can be okay and skillful. I've had all kinds of different relationships to questions of lineage over the years, and I think that's okay. Vince?
I've got nothing to add. I think this has been a delightful conversation, and for those that made it this far, thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, well, again, thank you so much, guys, for coming on. Always appreciate talking to you guys, and I hope
Thanks,
to talk
James.
to you guys again soon. All right,
Thank you,
take care.
James. Appreciate
Bye.
it. Bye, Daniel.